Veteran journalist Seymour Hersh is back with new reporting about the Nord Stream pipeline blast. Hersh claims that the Washington Post report story that we covered here on Rising yesterday is yet another planted CIA cover story. That article parsed the theory that a single 50-foot yacht, found at the scene, the Andromeda, was used to plant the bombs that blew up Nord Stream. That's a feat that Hersh says is frankly impossible. Quote, chalk one up for the various CIA officials who have been supplying phony stories to the media here and abroad in what has been a successful effort to keep the world focused on any possible suspects outside of what has emerged as the most logical one, the President of the United States. So this is a very, I would say it's a spicy Substack post full of, I think, well-deserved I told you so's. Pointing to just the impossibility of this sailboat being the culprit. So the difficulty of the sailboat finding the exact right place where the pipeline would be, then of the divers getting down to the pipeline, because it's actually not very big. It's way down there on the ocean floor. They would only have basically like 15 minutes. It'd be hard for divers to do this. Anyway,
it's a very difficult technical dive, which is why Seymour Hersh spent so much time in his initial reporting explaining how there's only so many training venues for divers to even get this kind of specialized knowledge, and there's only so many countries that have the ability to train people in this way, and there's only so many divers in the entire planet that were actually trained to do this kind of exercise. And that is the kind of detail that gave so much authenticity and credibility to Seymour Hersh's reporting. Now, as he points out in this subsequent reporting, much of the world embraced that reporting and was interested in it, reported on it, investigated into it, etc., outside of the United States. What did the United States do in the alternative? A few weeks went by when they basically ignored Seymour Hersh's reporting. Reporters that asked about it in press conferences were told that they were basically listening to a propagandist who had been discredited. There were a lot of ad hominem attacks. And then a few weeks later, the New York Times puts out this story about this alternative theory that it could have been a boat that was found with some explosive dust on it. And as Hersh points out in this latest piece, even in the context of that reporting, so it was a New York Times story that the New York Times' podcast later covered with one of the authors of that story. The author kind of acknowledged in the context of the podcast that they were looking for an alternative solution than the most obvious one based on motive, looking for someone who did this that wasn't the United States, trying to frame the story other than the way it had been framed by Hersh, and also acknowledging that some of the holes that people had tried to poke in Hersh's story initially, including that it was impossible for a boat to evade surveillance, evade detection, would have also been the case for their alternate version of events, where the civilian boat craft was apparently supposed to have made it to the drop point and conducted this dive, etc. So in his new reporting, Seymour Hersh goes through all of those inconsistencies again, and he says, quote, the trick of a good propaganda operation is to provide the targets, in this case the Western media, with what they really want to hear. One intelligence expert put it to me more succinctly. When you do an operation like the pipelines, you need a plan to counter-op, a red herring that has a whiff of reality, and it must be as detailed as possible to believe. I think the issue was this New York Times counter story and this Washington Post kind of cover-up. It's not detailed. In the Washington Post story where it's like, well, I guess maybe there had to be a second boat, it's revealing how flimsy that counter narrative really was. Very flimsy. And also, while at the same time, slipping on who they're actually blaming here, because they're not, no serious journalistic project is actually pointing the finger at the Russians anymore, which was what they wanted to do in the first place, even though, as you've pointed out many times, there wasn't really motive. That was just kind of a reaction to the general, reprehensible nature of what the Russian government is doing in Ukraine. But again, this would be counter to some of their aims, so it doesn't make any sense. So there's no other culprit. So people are naturally blaming because, well, Zelensky, the U.S., what are our interests here? Again, what did Biden himself say about what would happen to the pipeline? And as you said, there's no actual details to paint a realistic story for what actually did happen in these mainstream media outlets. Seymour Hersh is filling in some details. Again, we can't
we can't vet his sources because they're not given here, and that should definitely be taken with a grain of salt.
But so much of what he's doing in this piece and in his initial reporting was just to ask the right questions and to see whether or not like what is being proposed logically flows from the right questions. So in this piece, he says, but why not a sailboat? Any serious student of the event would know that you cannot anchor a sailboat in waters that are 260 feet deep, the depth at which the 4 pipelines were destroyed. But the story was not aimed at him. I'll skip forward a little bit. The intelligence expert he was talking to listed all the elements needed before any individual or group could charter an expensive yacht. You could not just walk off the street with a fake passport and lease a boat. You either need to accept a captain who is supplied by the leasing agent or owner of the yacht, or have a captain who comes with a certificate of competency as mandated by maritime law. Anyone who ever chartered a yacht would know that.
Yeah.
You know, like these kinds of things. How does a 49-foot sailboat find the pipelines in the Baltic Sea? Pipelines are not big, to your point, and they're not on the charts that come with the lease. Like these are logical questions to ask, which, when you ask them, don't poke holes in Hersh's initial accounting, which of course might not be accurate, but do poke holes in all of the alternatives that have been presented so far.
Yeah. What else is there to say? This is he paints a very compelling picture that this is just propaganda to distract you from what, don't believe your lying ears, essentially. What we're hearing, what we heard our own government say about the reality of the situation. And so they could, they can put, they can sort of get around being blamed if you were to actually have an investigation. If you actually want to have an honest investigation to find out who really did this, then okay, then that would deflect some of that suspicion, maybe, but they're not even doing that.
Right. We should play a little bit of what Seymour Hersh had to say in response to criticisms he had received after his initial reporting came out when he was here on Rising. Let's take a look. People who are criticizing you on the basis of the source. And I wondered if you could give us any more insight into what you, not any obviously facts about who the source is or any identifying information, but what made you feel confident about the source's firsthand knowledge and the accuracy of the knowledge that the source presented to you. Obviously, there's a great deal of kind of factual detail about how strategically the plan was carried out. But in terms of the source confirming that the source was who they represented, that they were in a position where they would have had firsthand knowledge of the events that they described to you, can you tell us anything about what assured you that the source was accurately representing their firsthand knowledge?
I've been in this business with sources like this for 50 years. When I first did BLI, there was, overwhelmingly disapproval of what I wrote, and most of the stories I wrote that were controversial has always been attacked on the it's easy to get rid of something on the basis of anonymity, and so you have to understand there's no alternatives. Either the people I've known inside have one thing in common, whether military or civilian, and that is they really understand that they've taken their oath of office not to their boss, not to the general or admiral, and not to the president, but to the Constitution. And those are people that, when they get troubled by things that are going on, have talked to me. And this been going on. I've done this for 50 years.
And and it's also worth noting in this piece, he points out that it seems like no journalist was invited on the Andromeda, this ghost ship, to conduct an investigation. It's very difficult to trace anything about this boat. The details that were provided about this boat, and this is what was so suspicious about that initial New York Times story, were exactly those details that were exculpatory to the U.S. government and Ukrainian government. The firm details in that story was that this was not a government actor. Don't look over here. We know that for certain. But basically everything else is like, I don't know, shrug. We'll wait for some European authorities to figure it out. And keep in mind that in the background of this, the United States has opposed there being an independent UN investigation into what caused this. They are expecting the international community to rely on investigations that are carried out by countries that are in fact implicated in this sabotage, according to Seymour Hersh. And of course, again, we don't know, we can't prove any of that is true, but obviously countries that have been harmed by this, like Russia, have an interest in not having countries that are in Germany, an
ally of the United States.
Right, but have an interest in countries like Denmark that were implicated in Seymour Hersh's initial reporting, not being the ones to carry out the investigation.
Right. Very troubling. But this is a great Substack piece from Seymour Hersh. Everyone should go read it. It's really good. And we will have more Rising right after this.